The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 14th chapter. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. Sometimes the Sunday readings are cut up in such a way that it feels like we're picking it up right in the middle of the story. Now, the English teachers in the crowd will tell you that there are clues to this in what we read. In fact, those clues are in the very first sentence that we read. Do you remember when it said, when he heard this, when Jesus heard this, whatever this is? And then it says, he withdrew from that place, got into a boat, and went to a deserted place. What place was he leaving? Now, some of us, we can read right past that and not even pay attention to those clues. But sometimes it's important to pay attention to what that tells us. If we were to back up in the story just a little bit, what we would find out is that what Jesus heard was that John the Baptist had been arrested. What Jesus heard was not only that John the Baptist was arrested and imprisoned, but that he had been beheaded. Now, Luke's gospel tells us that John and Jesus are cousins or distant relatives of some kind. All of the gospels tell us that John the Baptist baptized Jesus. And some commentators suggest that Jesus maybe was even a disciple of John at one point. No matter how you cut it, there is a deep relationship between Jesus and John. And to hear the news that Jesus heard, the news that John had been arrested and was imprisoned, but more so had been beheaded by Herod for the threat, apparently, that he was for Herod and his rule. That would be deeply troubling. So he left that place. He withdrew from that place. And what place is that? We have to back a little farther up in the story, and we find out that Jesus has gone to his hometown. He went home. What a wonderful thing. And when he got home, he went to the synagogue and he started to teach. It's a good thing for him to do. They were astounded by what they heard. They were impressed by by his interpretation of the scriptures and the authority by which he taught. And you know what? When the hometown boy comes home preaching with that kinds of authority, it doesn't take long for astounded to become offended. The crowd became a bit surly. They were asking themselves, don't we know this guy? Isn't he that son of a carpenter? And they didn't believe. And so the story tells us, Matthew is certain to tell us that while he was in his hometown, he didn't do very many deeds of power because of their unbelief. Jesus has been having a not very good few days. Things have been kind of collapsing in. It makes sense that he would withdraw from that place, particularly having heard the news of John, that he would withdraw from that place, that he would want to go to a deserted place, that he would want to be in a place where he could be alone, where he could sort things out, where he could grieve, where he could figure out what's next. It kind of makes sense for us, doesn't it? And so he gets in the boat and he goes, but the crowds hear that he's going. And in spite of all those people who don't believe and think, well, he's just that son of the carpenter, in spite of that story about John being beheaded, the people flock to him. They meet the boat. He shows up and there they are. It would be very understandable if he had said, gosh, it's been a bad day. Could you just give me a break? Give me some space. They keep showing up. I hear stories, I may even remember some of these stories, of young parents with young children who need some space, head to the bathroom, and whoop, there they are. Perhaps Jesus had one of those moments. Can I have some space? But there they are. And what does it tell us? Instead of saying he backed them away, what it tells us, what Matthew wants us to hear is that Jesus had compassion for them. He had compassion for them and he cured their sick. Now, as the day continued, the disciples, gotta love the disciples. They've been walking with this guy for a long time. And in the midst of walking with him, they have heard him proclaiming that the reign of God has come near. They have heard him not only saying it, but doing it. He has been bringing healing and wholeness and well-being, restoring people to community, forgiving people. He has been living God's mission in their presence. One would hope that they got it. And they're looking at their watches and saying, you know, Lord, it's getting late. And we don't have very much food here, so you need to send those people into town. Let them go buy for themselves. Now, jumping clear to the end, basically he had about probably close to at least, well, the men alone were the population of Boone County. Send them into town, because you know those villages could handle it. Right? And Jesus says, no, you feed them. You feed them. And they said, but Lord, all we've got is 5 loaves and 2 fish. 5 loaves, 2 fish. This past week, I was at a conference where Gina Campbell was presenting. And Gina Campbell is a Methodist pastor who's serving in an Episcopal church, and that's not all that important. What's important is that she is a trainer for godly play. Godly play is a Christian formation, a faith formation model, a way of doing, well, we call it Sunday school. A way of helping young people to grow into their faith. It uses the Montessori method as its ground, as its base, as its theoretical perspective. And what the Montessori method does, and what the godly play method does, is it tells the story, and it has physical things that the kids can work with. And as they work with it, then after the story is told, the children are asked to kind of tell the story themselves, to reenact it, if you will. And in that way, they make God's story their own story. But she talked about how, for many people, the great difficulty of being trained as a teacher in godly play is that we often get so wrapped up in the objectives and the curriculum and the things that we have to get done in the class period that we forget to pay attention to how the children are learning. We don't allow for the process. And so one of the things that she was talking about was that they try to, when they're training teachers in that faith formation model, that they try to teach the teachers to hang on to one thing, and that is, we have all the time we need. What happens when we change perspective from we don't have enough time to get everything done to we have all the time we need? What happens when we're focused on scarcity? My suspicion is it tightens us up. When we focus on the availability of all that we need, it opens a space. As I listened to this story, I found myself thinking about the ways that what Gina was talking about are modeled for us in Jesus. That where the disciples are caught up in focusing on scarcity and we don't have enough, Jesus is offering a whole different understanding of what it is to live in God's reign. And that understanding is an understanding that says we have all that we need. It's sufficient. And so in this time when many of us have an awful lot of things to accomplish, when time is scarce, when there are all kinds of things demanding our time, it may be important to change our focus from the scarcity of time to we have all the time and we need. In this time when our culture is shifting around us and all kinds of things are affecting the way that we are going to be church. In fact, it's not just the church, but all organizations. In the midst of all of that, it would be easy for us to focus on how we don't have enough. What happens if we change to trusting that by God's grace, we have all that we need? As we look to our future and to what God is preparing for us, as we spend time wrestling with all of that, thinking about how God is already active in our community and calling us to be God's hands in that world, bearing God's good news. We could focus on, well, I don't really have, or we could trust that God has already gifted us with all that we need. That's what Jesus does today. He says to those disciples, well, what do you have? Bring it. 5 loaves, 2 fish. And he lifts it up. He blesses it. And they use it. And there is enough. Jesus invites us to bring what we have, bring who we are, that he may bless it and we may use it, and there will be enough. We have all that we need. We practice for it every week. We rehearse it. We play it. Every week as we come and we hear the word proclaimed, but more so as we gather around this table. And as we gather around the table, there is enough for everyone. We have all that we need. And in the end, all ate and were filled. And they gathered up the scraps, 12 baskets full. We have all that we need.